Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this session on getting to we, where to start when you want your group to thrive. And I'm assuming if you're here, you're interested in your team or your group or a community you're a part of to do better, to have more connection, to have more safety, to have more trust, to have more sense of togetherness. And So that's why I created this. I created this because what I've seen in my work and also my personal life, what I've seen is that a lot of groups are struggling with this. And I would say probably the majority of groups. Um, it's not very common to have groups that are really thriving on those levels around safety and trust and connection. And um, it's also not, the interesting thing is it's also not that hard in a way, but our models are not so good. The way all of us were, or many of us, I would say, were taught um, for how to be together. We didn't have a lot of great models for how groups can actually create those connections and build that safety and trust. And so that's what motivated me to put this out there, is that I think this is kind of basic knowledge that a lot of us need, especially in these times. And I think our groups need it. We need to have a way for all of us to be able to be with one another that helps to create um, that sense of basic fulfillment. Um, and I'm just gonna pause the slides for a moment just to speak personally. About 7 years ago, I found myself in a place in my life where I was dealing with challenges on many different fronts. My wife was having chronic health issues coming up. That was, some days she couldn't get out of bed. We had a new child, and then there's also some challenges with the sort of the farm that we were running at the time. And all of those were happening simultaneously. And those of you who know me and know my work know that, I've been in the field of, meditation, mindfulness, nonviolent communication, a lot of these great, really essential personal skills for most of my adult life. So I had, a lot of the kinds of skills that I think people point you to when you have challenges. They say, well, go do some self-care, and they want you to kind of learn practices, like mindfulness, et cetera, or talk to a therapist. And I had a lot of those things in place. But what I really realized through that time is it's really not enough. And many of us live in very hyper individualist societies that are very capitalist driven, that are really, they have the phrases like, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And I think it really ignores a huge aspect of who we are as social creatures. Because what I really found helped the most through that time was the groups, the teams that I was a part of because of my work, where we had established these kinds of uh, collective care cultures that help us to thrive. And that included my work. And so I don't know how many other people get by without those kinds of systems in place in the groups they're a part of. I think it's really hard to expect people to navigate the challenges of today with the multiple crises happening on these wider levels, whether it's, political crises in your country, economic crises, or global climate crises. There is so much all of us are working with today, in addition just to basic personal challenges or challenges in your family or your work, that I think it's a lot to expect that for any individual to navigate those just with personal like self-care skills, or even a therapist, or even your family. That's a lot of pressure on two parents if you live in that kind of nuclear family, right? So for all those reasons, it's been really important to me to kind of do a push and work on giving more of these kinds of collective care skills, group cohesion skills, put those out into the world. And um, so I just wanted to share that as part of the reason personally for why I'm doing this now. And so I hope this presentation will be helpful for you. The first thing I want to just ask you is, what are some signs a group is struggling? Or what are some signs your group is struggling? And I just want you to take a moment to think about this, and I'll give some examples in a moment as well. But may have noticed some things in your own organization, your own community group, seeing some people write in around low trust to share difficult things, people afraid to speak something that's true for them. And that's a big one, right? Because I'm seeing like the top first 5 shares in the chat are all about that, people being afraid to speak because of the lack of trust. Conflict between people, yeah, gossip, mental health issues, right and wrong, lack of self-responsibility. That's a really huge one too. So all of these are common things that happen in our groups that let us know that there's some underlying issues within the group, right? I'm going to add to this just some common pitfalls I've seen, which overlap with some of the things you've already said. Lack of clear guidelines for what we're doing together or how we're doing it. Usually what happens when a group gathers and there's a lack of clear guidelines, people will just default to their habitual ways of being with other people. And often it's self-protective, oftentimes just staying silent and waiting for someone to take the lead, right? A common one that I saw named in the chat is assigning blame when there's failure, focusing on who's responsible and what went wrong, which can also contribute to lack of safety and trust, you know, and people not wanting to speak up if there's a mistake made. Power imbalance or dominating voices. One or few people speak the most and always have the most influence. I've been part of many groups where this was the case, including a government agency that I was elected to. Avoidance of conflict. This is maybe one of the most common ones. And there's a sense that certain forms of expression are negative. People will actively move to avoid or shut down any voices that look like they're expressing something that might be dissenting or tension. And even more commonly is just self-silencing. People themselves not voicing dissent or anything that may feel like disagreeing with the group. And finally, a really common one is an emphasis on head over heart and hands. And what I mean by that is the culture is really one of exchanging opinions and not values and actions. And again, like what I was sharing at the beginning of this call is, I think most of us, because we're educated, our most biggest imprinting around being in a group is often public school. That a lot of these behaviors come out of what we learned consciously or unconsciously in public school, to exchange opinions. You know, we want to show off our intellect, you know, so that we can succeed in this in getting good grades. We avoid creating tension or conflict or dissent because we know that gets us punished or in trouble. There's a power imbalance or dominating voices because the teacher or the principal, those are the people in charge. So they're the people who are going to speak the most and have the most influence. You know, et cetera. All of these things, most of them come out of public school. And if I go back to the top one, this lack of clear guidelines for what we're doing together or how we're doing it, you know, then the default is you're going to default to your main imprinting around group behavior. So for many people, that's going to be, you're going to go back to your public school behavior because that's, you know, no one else is giving you other guidelines, right? So I say that as a kind of empathy for all groups who are having this experience. because it comes from somewhere. It's not that people don't want to thrive together. It's not that people are ill-intentioned. It's you know it's the imprinting we have, right? So I want to start here by also dispelling a myth, which is a lot of times people will say if a group's struggling, well, it's because one, two, or more people within the group are bad apples, bad seeds. Like if you get that narcissistic person out of the group, or the person who's talking all the time, um, or etc. If we get rid of that person, then the group would do better. And now research says something different. I really like this Google's Project Aristotle. I reference it a lot because Google basically went through this multi-year process of they were so interested in figuring out what makes a team successful. And they invested lots of money, time, people, resources to figure this out. And a typical Google approach, to just kind of make it super data driven and really, figure out what makes a team successful. And there's really interesting things that came out of this. And one of this is that the project concluded that who was on a team mattered less than how the team worked together. So this should be a relief to anyone who feels like the reason that your team or your organization isn't working is because the individuals who are on it. So I want to look at what are the top 3 needs when people gather. We can get into a lot of different strategies and things for working with groups and how to bring them together. But what you really want to know before you choose your strategy, before you choose how you approach it, is you want to look at, well, what are the needs? What is it underlying all the behaviors that are dysfunctional? And at Bobbitry International, what my team and I have found over and over again over the years is that the top 3 needs when people gather are safety, trust, and respect. So whenever we are working with an organization, whenever we are working with a new group of people that are gathering, we always address those needs first and foremost. Those are the top 3 needs that people want to have met when they come together with other people. And so when you look at your own group, your own team or community, I encourage you to start by thinking in terms of those 3 needs. Where are those 3 needs being met and where are they not being met? And this is the same thing Google actually found as well, as the top need for the top need for groups is around psychological safety. The number one thing to address when you want your group to succeed, when you want your team to succeed. And in doing this, they actually went back to other research around groups, and they looked at the work of Amy Edmondson, who is pioneering on this. She's a Harvard Business School professor. And one of the things she found is that the sense of safety and willingness to speak up in a group is not an individual trait. Even though you can feel that experience individually, it's an emergent property of the group. So in other words, safety is something we create together. It's not about individuals who are somehow more self-confident, have more self-esteem. They're not the drivers of the safety. It's how actually the group is together. So again, this is pointing us back to how are we together? It's not about, picking out individuals who are ruining the group or individuals who are creating more safety because they themselves are so self-confident. It's about what are our behaviors as a group together? How can we address this? One last thing I want to put out here is, so another research piece that's really helpful here is, okay, so if we're not looking at individuals and we're looking at behaviors of the group, what are the 2 behaviors of good teams? And this is what Google found. The first is that on good teams, people spoke in roughly the same proportion to one another. So you could call this equality in distribution of conversational turn-taking. So not having one person dominate the conversation all the time. The other behavior of effective teams were they all had what they called high average social sensitivity, which is basically saying the group collectively were very skilled at intuiting how each other were feeling based on tones of voice, expressions, and other nonverbal expressions. So another way you could put this, although Google didn't write it this way, is that another behavior of a good team is that they're empathic, that they're listening and connecting with one another. And remember, this isn't a research study of, let's say, nonviolent communication. This is a research study by Google, right? And when they say the 2 behaviors of good teams, I mean, these are the top 2 by far. And if you dive into the research as I have, the other qualities and behaviors aren't even close. So it really, when they say these 2 behaviors, I really want to highlight this and build around this, because this is what data shows among hundreds, if not thousands, of teams that they studied. So I want to give you right now some ways to start adopting these behaviors today in your organization. So I'm starting with the first one, equality and distribution of conversational turn-taking. The first is to sit in a circle rather than facing one person. A lot of times, again, we default to kind of public school behavior and set things up so that one person's the speaker and everyone faces that person. That makes it harder to have equality and distribution of conversational turn-taking, because we can't all see each other, and naturally our attention gravitates towards the person we're facing. So if we sit in a circle, we can actually face everyone. This of course is in person. Online we can do gallery view or something in Zoom. The second is to give each person on the circle an opportunity to speak their perspective in relationship to the topic at hand without interruption. So this is literally equality and distribution of conversational turn-taking, right? If you have a topic or a focus of the group, if everyone has a chance to speak their perspective on that, then already you're creating some equality in the conversation. Now, naturally, some things you're going to need to have someone present or share information. Like, for example, like even here today, there may be things in your work or places in the groups that you gather where someone's presenting. So there may not be time to hear from everyone. But then in your next meeting, invite those who haven't spoken in the previous meeting to be the first to speak next time. So conversational turn-taking isn't just in one meeting. It can happen over multiple meetings, right? And that's also what Google found. They weren't saying that at every meeting, every person spoke. They were saying over time, the group had a very clear sense that everyone's voice mattered and everyone's voice was heard and shared. Rotating leadership of the meetings. So if that's possible in your group, that can be a really helpful way to also support equality and conversational turn-taking. Yeah.
Good.
Finally, removing retribution and blame for reporting failures and mistakes. So this, of course, is another really big one in organizations. And it's also one of the key ways to create safety in your organization is to remove that retribution and blame. And if you think about it, let's say you're listening to this and you're a manager and say, well, if you get rid of the blame, then people won't take responsibility. I would say to you here, what responsibility do you think people are going to want to take if they know that when they report their failures and mistakes, they're going to be blamed or have retribution? And that's actually what the research also showed around this, is that when Amy Edmondson began her research around psychological safety in teams, she thought at first that what she would find is that the teams that have greater psychological safety were making fewer mistakes. Instead, she found the opposite. The teams that had the most psychological safety on the surface seemed like they made the most mistakes. But when she dove into it further, it was because the teams that had the most psychological safety, people were willing to report their mistakes because they weren't afraid of retribution or blame. So in fact, it was on the teams where there was low psychological safety that few mistakes were reported, but more was actually happening under the surface and more issues were happening. So everything actually took longer. So even from let's say, a productivity or a business standpoint, having retribution and blame as part of your group culture actually works against the goals of your business or your agency. So you really want to remove that so that there's no disincentive or punishment for reporting failures and mistakes. The second behavior of a successful team about intuiting how others feel, it's a little trickier for how to implement that. And I'm going to share a few things here, but I want to acknowledge that even Google, with all their research and all their focus on this, they had a much harder time knowing how to foster this in their teams. And it's often put like this is more magic than science, this piece. But I'm going to share some things because this is one area where I believe what we've been doing at Bobbitry International, I think we've got a little bit more experience on Google around this. So the first is to create a group norm where people are asked to listen to one another without interruption and follow it, especially if you're someone who's in power in that group. The other is to ask people to turn off their other devices when meeting together and bring their full presence to whoever is speaking. Starting meetings with a minute of mindful silence without distractions or devices to support everyone to fully arrive physically and mentally and emotionally. So all of these are ways to actually support our natural biological ability to be present to others. And in fact, when we support that, then we are actually also supporting people's natural ability to intuit how others feel to kick in more. So for any human being, if we are distracted, if we are thinking about other things, it's harder to intuit how others are feeling because our attention isn't on them. But if we start to create conditions where our natural ability to do that is fostered, then it becomes much easier. So I think one of the things I want to name here is that intuiting how others feel isn't necessarily something you really need to teach people about so much as to help people remember how to do that or support them to be able to, their natural ability to do that to come out. Another is to connect whatever is being discussed to people's values. For example, by asking the question, would you tell us more about what's important to you about this? And this is because, again, because of a lot of the way we've been educated or maybe the existing culture in your team, we're maybe more used to just sharing our opinions or what we think about things. So it helps to have someone who's going to encourage you to start to speak about how is it important to you and to start to connect it to values. And that'll start to open up the ability for people to explore the other dimensions of what it means to connect and communicate, which is also going to support the ability to intuit how others feel. And finally, if you're trying to replace the culture of blame and retribution, then when mistakes are made, instead of asking, who did it and what went wrong, asking the question, what did you learn? That's one of the common recommendations for fostering psychological safety on a team is to make mistakes an opportunity for learning and to actively inquire about what was learned rather than focusing on what was wrong and how do you fix it. Finally, I want to share the #1 most effective way to contribute to those basic needs on a team, safety and trust. It's for those in the group who are perceived as having the most power to be the first to take the emotional risk that they're asking others to take. So because so many of our groups and teams default to these habitual ways we've been imprinted around safety, we're used to assessing when we come into a group who has the power. And sometimes this is obvious, right? If you're on a work team, then the managers or senior people in the group are seen as having the most power. But in other groups, this may be less obvious. And then sometimes we need to look at here issues around gender and race and ability and sexual orientation. So, quite often it's the men in the room who are seen as having the most power. In the States, it might be the white cisgender, men and English speaking people around the world are often seen as having the most power. So it's important to know all this in whatever culture you're in, because if you, for example, are going to be seen as the person who has the most power, then you have a lot of leverage to help contribute to safety and trust by being the first to take that emotional risk. And I'll give you a really powerful example that's actually also within the Google research, is that when they took all their research about what makes for an effective team and creating psychological safety on a team, when they took that to their teams, like I said before, they really weren't sure how to foster that, for example, that sense of intuiting how others feel on a team. They just knew that it was important. So they started out with having teams, conduct these surveys about psychological safety, but then sort of leaving it to the teams themselves to figure out, okay, now that you know this, how are you going to do it? And one of the most successful teams was a team led by a man he'd been a senior manager for a different team that really fell apart. And this was his second time around. And he really didn't want to repeat that mistake. And he saw the research, he did the survey and saw that his second team was having very similar issues around trust and safety. And he took a leap of faith, where when he brought the team together and he discussed with them, some of the new research from Google's internal studies, and started talking about the importance of being able to discuss challenges openly. He kind of took an emotional leap himself. And again, he was the senior manager, so he was going to be the person seen as having the most power. And he took the emotional risk and he said, folks, you don't know this, but I've got stage 4 cancer. And he was looking at, not knowing how much longer he had to live. And he was working with that at home and in his family and with his kids. And this was something he hadn't revealed yet to his team. And his team, which up till that point had been a fairly reserved, typical kind of tech team where people don't share emotions and only report in, but then keep their mouths shut, they really started opening up. And one after another, each person started sharing other challenges they were having in their life. And this team actually became one of the most effective teams. And they have some quotes in the internal reports from this team, and they're just talking about how affecting it was for them to hear their senior manager speak about his stage 4 cancer and what a difference that made to them, and how it started to help them realize the importance of sharing these other pressures that were on their minds and hearts. And so, again, it's so important, if you are in a position of power or you will be seen as a position of power in the room, to be the first to take those emotional risks and how much that can influence the group culture. I also want to share with you about a course that I'm going to be doing starting in about 2 weeks. And that's connected. It's a continuation of what we're doing here today. Because what I'm not able to get to today in 30 minutes or 45 minutes is all the practices that our organization has developed over the years when we're supporting groups, supporting organizations to develop a culture of connection, of building trust, of building psychological safety. We've developed practices that are extremely effective for doing that. So not just guidelines like I shared with you today, but actual, this is what you do. And I'll be sharing those in an upcoming course I'm calling We Care, and as opposed to self-care. And in that course, I'll be sharing not just the practices, but I'm going to give you absolutely everything you need to take those practices straight to whatever group or team you're in and actually implement them right away. And so that's my goal in the course. So in the course that I'm going to be introducing, I want to share with you some aspects about it. The first is that the strategies I'll share with you in the course for creating psychological safety in your group or team, they work across age and culture. So remember how earlier I was saying that a lot of our kind of dysfunctional strategies for being with each other in a group are often imprinted at a school age, right, in primary school. And a lot of the practices that we introduce from our organization to other organizations and activist groups and housing communities and schools and businesses actually were born in my wife's school, Catherine Cadden, for those of you who know her. She started a school that ran for 11 years, and she was actually interested from the beginning in how to create a culture based on peace and nonviolence. How do you actually embed that into the fabric of a school so that the students who come out of it have that understanding of how to do that in the group? And so because those practices were created at her primary school, they work across age. And because those practices were designed to be accessible even for children as young as 4 years old, they're actually quite simple. They're simple practices. They aren't complicated or require days and days of training. And they also work really well across culture. We've shared these practices on 6 continents, in many different languages. They can be integrated immediately into existing group meeting formats. You don't need to have expert facilitators with you when doing this or additional training. Everything in the course I'll give you gives you exactly the toolkit you need and the materials you need. They give space for anger and despair, as well as joy and gratitude. Sometimes people are worried about, well, how well do these practices help when people are really upset or big emotions? And these practices give space for that and give a container for that. And they can be used both online and offline. So the course is called We Care, Collective Compassion Practices for Creating Thriving Teams and Communities. That will start at 6 p.m. New York time on October 8th. In Australia, Sydney, it'll be 9 a.m. October 9th. And we'll be meeting weekly for the month of October. What I really encourage you to do, if you're part of an existing group or team that you're wanting to kind of take this with, to sign up as groups of 5 or more. And I give huge discounts for that, $400 off for every person who signs up in a group of 5 or more. And this isn't actually, just like a marketing strategy. This is actually because what I see that's the most effective way you can introduce these practices into a group is to have a core group of people within your group or team that are adopting them initially together. And that's what you're going to do in the course. If you take the course, everyone will be practicing these practices in between the live course sessions. I'll be giving you video guidance for your group to actually do an experiment of practicing each of the practices I'll introduce you to, so that by the end of the course, you'll actually have experience doing these practices in a small group, and ideally within a small group of people that is on one of your existing teams or groups that you're part of. Because what we've seen in so many different groups and businesses and organizations and housing communities that we've introduced this to is that if you have a core group of people that actually has some experience with this practice, their results, you could say, the results of what they've seen, they can now speak to those results from their personal experience. They can say, hey, we tried these practices together. We found it so deepened our trust, it deepened our connection, it deepened our ability to deal with some of the stresses we're facing as a larger group. Can we share these with you, with the larger team, right? That has so much more impact than a single person within the group trying to convince a team or convince a manager to try something. If you have a pod within the group, it is more convincing for a lot of teams and groups to see those results. And it makes it less likely that one person will has to take such a huge risk, right? If you're an individual on a group or a team and you're trying to share something new like this, it can feel much more risky. But if you're part of a team of five who are trying to share this with the group, then the risk is shared and it makes it an easier lift. So that's the website link at the bottom. If you're interested in learning more, I have lots more written there and a little video about all the modules and what you would learn in the course. So you can check that out when this is over, if you'd like. No matter who you are or where you're at with your groups and the teams you're on and organizations, I wish you all the best. And I really appreciate you for coming here today to pick up some of this knowledge and these skills to support your communities. Because I truly believe that all of you who are doing that are helping make our world a better place for all of us. So thank you so much.